All right, well, you're turning to Daniel 2. Earlier this week, I ran across an article by Daniel Gilbert, who's a psychology professor at Harvard. This is from several years ago, but the title of the article was fitting, What You Don't Know Makes You Nervous. He writes, he drew on the Gallup Healthways Well-Being Index and argued that the index showed that Americans are smiling less, are worrying more than they were a year ago. Again, this was written a decade ago, and I think it's even more fitting now. Happiness is down, sadness is up, we're getting less sleep, we're smoking more cigarettes, depression is on the rise. And he stated that the real problem is not financial. It's not that people don't have enough money, but something else. And he said the root issue for most people's unhappiness is uncertainty. People don't know what's going to happen. We'll have a job next week. What's ahead in the future? And he pointed to a Dutch experiment, which I didn't know you could do experiments like this, but I think it illustrates the point well, where one group was told they were going to be intensely shocked 20 times. A second group was told they were going to be strongly shocked 3 times, and they'd get 17 mild shocks, but they didn't know when the strong shocks were coming. He said the results of this study were that subjects in the second group sweated more, experienced faster heart rates, that uncertainty caused their discomfort, and they didn't know when the shocks were coming next. He summarized with this, as an uncertain future leaves us stranded in an unhappy present with nothing to do but wait. Our national gloom is real enough, but it isn't a matter of insufficient funds, it's a matter of insufficient certainty. Again, like I said, this was from 2009, but I think fits our culture well today. For many of us here today, there are few moments and few years that have produced more uncertainty than the present. There was a lot of uncertainty about what would happen in this presidential election, not only on Tuesday, but in the days that followed. There's the uncertainty of what American politics will look like the next 4 years, with a couple important races still to be decided. There's the uncertainty surrounding COVID and what the winter months will bring and what increasing diagnosis mean for our future. And because these things seem so out of control, there's been a host of other uncertainties that have been piled on top. That because of what's happened in our country, many of you have experienced uncertain employment and school situations and financial realities and relationships. And if uncertainty breeds unhappiness, it's not surprising that unhappiness would be a widespread experience right now. I know that there's been no other time in the years that I've been a pastor where I've had more counseling sessions with people just simply struggling with mental and physical exhaustion and fatigue. And when I had planned on preaching this brief series on politics, this was not the sermon I'd planned on preaching the Sunday after the election. I figured at this point we would clearly know who the president was going to be. It looks like we do. And I planned on spending the morning asking, how should we respond to a new leader as followers of Jesus? But as I talked to members at City of God and watched the news unfold and processed my own thoughts, it seemed like the better message as we wrap up this series on politics might be this: how can we as Christians respond when so much seems uncertain in our world? What hope do we have? And secondly, if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, my hope is this, that you leave here understanding what is the hope the Christian faith provides in the midst of such an uncertain season. This brings us to Daniel 2. And before getting into the text, it's worth noting this. There's a lot of similarities between Daniel's situation and our own. In this book, the book of Daniel, Israel's in exile. And they've been driven from the promised land by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And as we open the book of Daniel, the people of God are in Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful men in human history with the most expansive kingdom in the world up to that point in time. And the book of Daniel was meant to be a guide for them. How should they live as strangers and exiles in a place that was not their home? And if you remember the first sermon from our series on politics here a few weeks ago, that was the same point we were making there, that as followers of Jesus, we also live in a world that's not our home. We also don't belong here permanently. And the question that the New Testament's trying to help us answer to some degree is, as strangers and exiles on this earth, how do we live as followers of Jesus? Hebrews 13:14 reminds us of this, for we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. And that's the mindset of those following Jesus. Again, there's a lot of similarities here. Daniel, how can I live in exile? For us today, how can we live in the time of our exile? And as we turn to Daniel 1 and 2, we see the parallels don't stop there. Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And at the beginning of this chapter, again, we're introduced to Nebuchadnezzar, who has all the power and all of the wealth and all of the might that anyone could ever want. And yet as we open chapter 2, what is true of this king? He's afraid. He's experiencing sleepless nights. He's having nightmares. He doesn't know what to do. And I think this is an important thing to remember from the outset. That no matter how much power you acquire in this life, no matter how much wealth you accumulate, regardless of how much you accomplish, those things cannot calm our deepest fears. If anyone should have had certainty over what they had accomplished, it should have been Nebuchadnezzar. But the reason these things can't calm all our fears is this: there will always be things outside of our control. And he's feeling the weight of this right now. That for many of us, we can pour all of our effort and time and energy into crafting the perfect life and landing the dream job and marrying the perfect spouse and having more money than we thought we would need and having successful children. And you can get all of those things, and yet those things can't stop the phone from ringing with the diagnosis you've been dreading. Those things can't keep the stock market from crashing. Those things can't ensure political races will always go the way that you wanted. Those things can't make certain that all of your relationships in this life will stay intact. And in the spirit of Ecclesiastes, they can't fend off the inevitable reality that there will be an end to this life for all of us. And so for all of his sufficiency, there's so much out of Nebuchadnezzar's control. And deep down, he knew it, and we know it, and he's terrified because he believes this dream is telling him something about his future, but he doesn't know what it means. And so he does what he knows how to do. He gathers this council of wise people around him to interpret the dream. We read in verses 3 to 6. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell the servants your dream, and we'll show you the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your house shall be laid in ruins. He doesn't simply want this group of people to interpret the dream for him. You need to tell me the dream that I had to prove that you are who you say you are. Verse 6. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. And what we see from Nebuchadnezzar here is this, is that when life feels out of control, we begin to act erratically. Because what he's asking here is an impossibility without the help of God. For this group of men to be able to tell him, what's the dream that I had? Maybe he forgot what he had dreamed. Maybe he's putting them to the test. But he's asking them to do something they can't do. That's what we do when we feel like life is out of control. We look for things to do what they can't do. And the wise men express this to him in verses 10 and 11. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Again, the king's looking for certainty and assurance, and the very men who were supposed to be able to provide that for him can't. And you can understand why this would be a scary moment for Nebuchadnezzar. He's looking for answers. He's asking the people who are supposed to be able to give him answers, and they can't. And maybe as we think through what we're experiencing 2020, that the root cause of the fear that many people are experiencing today is that they're looking for security and they're looking for answers, and they haven't been able to find anyone or anything that could provide it yet. This is, I think, why we put so much hope and faith in politicians. Maybe they'll be the ones to give me security and to make life easy and to give me the things that I need, the hope that I need. And it's been interesting to watch people's reactions to the events of the past week. You've seen celebration, you've seen anger, you've seen excitement, you've seen fear. And some of that's to be expected because the results of elections really do matter. They really do impact people's lives. This isn't a sermon where I'm saying that the results of what happened in these elections won't have consequences for people. But it's possible that some of the wild swings in emotion that we're experiencing is because we're expecting politicians and parties to do what only God can. And when they let us down, we're not sure how to respond. The reason it seems as if an increasing majority of people live and die with politics is because many have decided to make politics their idol. It's the God that they worship. This was written a couple of years before this year, but Tim Keller in 2017 said this about American politics. I think it's spot on. He wrote, "One of the signs that an object is functioning as an idol is that fear becomes one of the chief characteristics of life. When we center our lives on the idol, we become dependent on it. If our counterfeit God is threatened in any way, our response is complete panic. We don't say, 'What a shame, how difficult,' but rather, 'This is the end, there is no hope.' This may be a reason why so many people now respond to U.S. political trends in such an extreme way. When either party wins an election, a certain percentage of the losing side talks openly about leaving the country. They become agitated and fearful for the future. They have put the kind of hope in their political leaders and policies that once was reserved for God and the work of the gospel. When their political leaders are out of power, they experience a death. They believe that if their policies and people are not in power, everything will fall apart. They refuse to admit how much agreement they actually have with the other party and instead focus on the points of disagreement. The points of contention overshadow everything else, and a poisonous environment is created." Another sign of idolatry in our politics is that opponents are not considered to be simply mistaken, but evil. Clearly, there are times when actual evil among our leaders needs to be called out. But after the last election, my 84-year-old mother observed, "It used to be that whoever was elected as your president, even if he wasn't the one you voted for, was still your president. That doesn't seem to be the case any longer. After each election, there's now a significant number of people who see the incoming president lacking moral legitimacy. The increasing political polarization and bitterness we see in U.S. politics today is a sign that we've made political activism into a new form of religion. How does idolatry produce fear and demonization?" And then he closes with this. Dutch-Canadian philosopher Al Wolters taught that in the biblical view of things, the main problem in life is sin, and the only solution is God and His grace. The alternative to this view is to identify something besides sin as the main problem with the world and something beside God as the main remedy. That demonizes everything that is not completely bad and makes an idol out of something that cannot be the ultimate good. And if we're expecting politics to make us happy and give us security and provide our lives with purpose, we're looking in the wrong place. And it seems like we remember this and then we forget, and then we remember this and then we forget. And that the questions we're trying to get answers to are questions that no created thing can answer. And Nebuchadnezzar's fearful. That's why he promised, "I'm going to kill all of the wise men if they can't help me." And so Daniel gets news of this. He's one of those wise men who's facing the prospect of death. He's a faithful Jew living in exile, and we read his reaction in verses 12 to 18. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men at Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel's first response to the news that he might be put to death was he gathered a group of friends together and prayed. And when we look at Nebuchadnezzar's response to uncertainty and the wise men of Babylon's response to uncertainty, it's fear, it's panic, it's anxiety. And Daniel, with a quiet confidence in chapter 2, is confronted with the reality that he may soon be put to death, and he gathers his closest friends together, and they begin to seek the mercy of God together. One of the things that becomes clear is this, is that when you follow Jesus, whenever you're facing life circumstances that are difficult, or when you're faced with uncertainty, our gut response is to respond in one of two ways. The first is this: because so much feels outside of our control, we try and control as much as we possibly can. And for those of you who are disposed to working hard and accomplishing things, that one of the reactions you might have to uncertainty is to work even harder and put more effort in and exert more control over the things you can control, because maybe you can't control these things, but you can really lock down certain aspects of your life. And my guess is some of you are here this morning and 2020 has prompted that kind of response from you. And you are absolutely exhausted, mentally and physically, trying to gain control over certain aspects of your life to try and feel better about everything that you can't control right now. I'm wired like that to some degree. Or secondly, our response when faced with uncertainty is this: to just numb ourselves to the uncertainty. And if I can find enough pleasure or distraction or entertainment, then maybe we can just forget about things for a while. Most people were joking, but the number of people on Twitter Tuesday night as the results were coming in that joked, I'm just going to go flip Netflix on. I'm going to go. We wanted to distract ourselves from the uncertainty. Or you can do what Daniel did. And his gut level response when faced with uncertainty was this: to take it to God. And look at what God provided for him in verses 19 to 23. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in the vision of the night. Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed is the name of God forever and ever, to whom belongs wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God, my Father, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked for. For you have made known to us the king's matter." That God does provide for Daniel here. In verse 19, you provided the mystery. He showed him the dream. He gave him the interpretation. And there may be times when you're facing difficulties and you pray to God. And if you've followed Jesus for any length of time, you probably have stories like this. And he shows up and moves in a powerful way. But there are also going to be times when life feels uncertain and you do cry out. And I talked to people this week. I've been crying out and it feels like God's not listening. It feels like God can't hear me. And if you read verses 19 to 23 again, what you discover is this: that the most comforting thing to Daniel in the situation was not God's answer to his prayer, as comforting as it was. Rather, in seeking God in the midst of turbulent times, Daniel was given a fresh picture of who God is. He was shown the character of God. He beheld the glory of God. And for all of us, the most important thing we can ever remember, whether times are good or times are bad, is the identity of the God that we worship. Because when you remember who God is, it allows you to worship instead of worry. That when God is the thing that your eyes are on, not everything that's out of control, it changes your perspective and changes your experience. And look at what Daniel praises God for here. God is wise and mighty. He changes the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He reveals mysteries. That Daniel breaks into a praise and worship service in the midst of probably one of the most stressful moments of his life. And as we read this, verse 21 is incredibly important for us to remember in an election year. What does Daniel say here? That God is the one who removes kings and sets up kings. It's similar to what Paul wrote in Romans 13, 1-2, when he said, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." I love what Doug Moo, one of my favorite New Testament commentators, writes about this passage when he says, the history of interpretation of Romans 13 has largely been an attempt to avoid what it says at first sight. That idea, that mindset that God is the one who installs earthly authorities, that those who sit on thrones are given their position and power and place by God himself. That what Daniel and Paul are both ascribing to here is this: that in God's sovereignty, the person he wants in authority will be in authority, not just the next 4 years, but as long as we continue on this earth. And Paul tells us to be subject to those leaders if they're not calling us to sin. And as we look throughout the Bible, we again find over and over God installing people in the positions He wants them, sometimes as a blessing, sometimes as a judgment, but all in their places of power by the hand and plan of God. And this can be an unsettling thought to some people. What about when God puts people in positions of power throughout history where we feel like they shouldn't have been there? But rather we can see Daniel 2:21 and Romans 13:1 and other texts as a great comfort, especially in an election year. God's plans and purposes for this earth and for this country will be done. And there's nothing that can happen at the ballot box that will thwart them. God is the one who is sovereign, and He is the one who is in control. And we can put our head on the pillow at night in the midst of uncertain times, knowing that the will of God will be accomplished. And we work, and we seek to be obedient, and we try and do good where we can do good. But at the end of the day, we lay our heads down knowing God will accomplish His purposes for this world because He's a God powerful enough to do those things. What Daniel needed in the face of an impossible task and a menacing ruler was to be reminded of who God was, not to have his circumstances changed. Often when we're afraid, we go to God more than we usually do, but we typically go asking for things. And there's nothing wrong with that. Change my situation, God. Give me what I need. Help me get out of the trouble that I'm in. And the assumption in that prayer request, again, it's not bad to ask God for stuff, but the assumption is we know what's best for us. God, you should do this for me because this is what I need. And again, it's not wrong to ask God for those things. But it would be good for us to take a cue from Daniel and to remember this, that when we are in the midst of uncertain times, the most significant thing we can do is to clearly look at God, to see Him for who He is, to be reminded of His power and His sovereignty, and to praise Him for those things, because it's amazing the medicine that praise can be for a restless soul. I grew up in central Kentucky, and growing up we had a pool. And one of the fun things of having kids of my own has been watching them swim in the pool that I grew up in. And so we've taught 4 kids to swim in that pool at this point. And if you've ever taught kids to swim, they typically follow a normal progression. First they're in with floaties, then they're in with the life jacket, then they're in wanting you to hold them, then they get tall enough to stand up in the shallow end on their own, then they want to go in the deep end with the life jacket. And the whole time this is progressing, there's one ultimate goal for a kid who's learning how to swim: jumping off the diving board. And they watch it, and they see people do it, and it looks so fun. And so eventually, kids learn how to swim, and then they work up the nerve to jump off the diving board, usually with a life jacket first. And every time I'd spend a half an hour promising my kids, you're not going to sink, you're not going to drown, you're wearing a life jacket, you've done this, you've been in water with this on, and nothing bad happened. And as much as you try and reason with them, it just takes so long, and they look over the edge, and they walk back, and they're thinking about it, and finally you get them to go. But that leads to the pinnacle, which is jumping off the diving board without a life jacket on, and with no floaties on. And it's just them in the water. And everybody else watching them that's not going to let anything else happen. But in their head, this is the most dangerous thing they've ever done. And so every time when my kids were ready, they'd walk to the diving board, they'd come to the edge, they'd look down, you could see there were worst case scenarios in their head. What happens if I go under? They're looking around at everyone watching, they're getting nervous, they're backing off, they're coming forward, we do this for like an hour. And then finally, I just have to get their attention. Hey, look at me. I'm right here. I'm standing up in the deep end. This is a perk of having me as your dad. Nothing can happen to you right now, okay? You're gonna jump. I'm gonna catch you. We're gonna walk to the side. I'm literally, as they're doing this, I've got my hands out, their hands are out. We're this far apart, and they're just terrified at what's about to happen. But the one thing that finally gets them to jump is this. They just don't look at anything else. Look at me. And then they jump, and they're so excited, and then I regret getting them to jump because I spend the next 3 hours doing the same thing over and over and over. But in that moment, what did they need? They needed to block everything else out and say, there's Dad, nothing's going to happen, and to just trust that I was going to do what's best for them. And I think for the American church, a lot of what God is doing right now, what He's trying to remind us of, is simply this. look at me. Because right now you're looking at pundits and podcasters and political leaders and business people and celebrities and everyone else we listen to tell us what's going to happen and what's best for us. And all the while, God is standing just inches from us saying, look at me. And when we see Daniel's response, that in the midst of certain death, what does he have? Confidence and worship. We see the powerful force that a clear picture of God can be in our lives when life doesn't make sense. And so we try and keep our eyes on God by making sure we're listening to His voice in Scripture as much, if not more, than all the other voices that we're hearing. That we gather together with other believers as regularly as we can to be reminded of who God is. That's why we sing, not just so I have a good emotional response to singing, to say these words to remind myself of who God is. To hear the word preached, to remind myself of what God has said. To share in communion, to remind myself of what God has done. And when those become the priorities, it doesn't mean life gets easier. It doesn't mean things make more sense. But we'll be able to respond much more like Daniel, who walked through this life in confidence and worship because he had a clear picture of God as opposed to the fear and anxiety of Nebuchadnezzar and of his other leaders. I wish I had more time in this text, but we'll start to wrap up here because Daniel was willing to listen to God. God gave him comfort. And Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar to explain the dream. And long story short, here's what God tells Daniel. The dream Nebuchadnezzar had means this: his kingdom will not last, and one day I will overthrow it. Which is not the message I would want to deliver to the most powerful person in the world at the time. But God says his kingdom will not last and I will overthrow it. And toward the end of Daniel explaining this dream, look at what he says, verse 44. This is Daniel speaking to the king. And in the days of those kings, Nebuchadnezzar and those who come after him, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all the kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by a human hand, or by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron and the bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold, these elements standing for other earthly kingdoms. That a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. God will overthrow the kingdoms of this world, and a day will come when he will judge them all and establish a kingdom that will not be shaken. And Daniel was able to have confidence in the midst of uncertainty because of God's promise. A kingdom is coming that I'll establish that will never be moved. And 2,000 years ago, Jesus Christ began his public ministry with this sermon, Matthew chapter 3, verse 2. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And what Daniel longed to see in the life and ministry of Jesus, Jesus begins to articulate, I am beginning to establish the kingdom that God promised. I'm beginning to establish the kingdom that will overthrow all other kingdoms. I'm beginning to establish the kingdom that cannot be moved. And in a point of even deeper connection with Daniel 2, notice this. Back in verse 45, Daniel says, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces, the iron, the bronze. He makes this point. There's this small rock that seemingly shatters these impenetrable materials. What is this little rock that's breaking up all these things? In Luke 20, verses 17 and 18, Jesus says this about himself. He looked directly at them and said, what then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. And Jesus announces that he is the fulfillment of Daniel 2. He is the stone that has been cut from the mountain by no human hand. He is the one who will rule and reign over all other kingdoms and authorities because of the power that God has given him. And Daniel could have confidence because of this future kingdom of God. But on the other side of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, where we stand now, We don't simply have confidence in a kingdom that is to come. We have confidence in a kingdom that has already been established and will be consummated in the future. And we know that right now, Jesus Christ is sitting at the right hand of the Father, ruling and reigning all things. And that does not change depending on anything that changes in this country. And because of that, when our world's out of control, when it doesn't make sense, when it seems as if everything is against us, we can remember while things seem chaotic now, they are not out of the hand of a sovereign God who will accomplish all of His purposes for this world. Dale Ralph Davis, who's written a helpful short commentary on the book of Daniel. If you want to go through Daniel on your own, I would recommend that one. Dale Ralph Davis. But he writes on Daniel 2:44. If I didn't believe Daniel 2:44 was true, that God would establish His kingdom, I couldn't find the energy to place one foot in front of the other every morning. And he says, this earth is looking for answers to questions that they will find nowhere else but in this. God will do what He's promised to do. God will establish a kingdom that will never be moved. And that doesn't mean life is easy. It doesn't mean we won't be tempted with fear and worry. It doesn't mean we can rest from seeking to do good in this world. But it does mean that if this kind of God has loved us so much that He would die for us to make us right with Him, why would we ever believe He would abandon us now or He would abandon us in the future? That this is something we can find certainty in during these uncertain seasons. I'm going to pray and we'll sing. Father, thank You for this morning and our time together. God, I pray that for some of us this morning we were given a clear picture of who You are, that we saw You on the throne, that we saw You ruling and reigning, and that we began to believe, you know what, we can trust. In the midst of a year that seems so out of control, we can trust and we can rest and we can sleep well because You are sovereign over all things. Help us see You as we leave this place. Help us remind ourselves to look at You regularly as the one place we can find a source of real lasting comfort and joy. And God, just help us be mindful of all that You've done for us, not just here, but as we leave this place. Father, we love You. We ask this all in Your Son's name. Amen.